About 2 hours, President Joe Biden and former President Donald Trump will take the debate stage in Atlanta. Our State Capitol Bureau Chief Vanessa Kelson talked to both sides of the aisle to preview tonight's event.
Ahead of the first presidential debate tonight, I spoke with Wisconsin Democrat Lieutenant Governor Sarah Rodriguez and the Deputy Director of Communications for former President Donald Trump about how they expect tonight's debate to compare to the last Biden-Trump matchup in 2020.
They know each other. Each of them has a record to stand on. We've got almost 4 years of President Biden doing fantastic for the economy of Wisconsin in particular.
I think it's a different America. The country is very different than it was for just 4 years ago. This is the first time in a century, I believe, that the American people have an opportunity to compare two former presidents and their records back to back. The American people are in a very unique position here.
You can check out both full interviews online right now. From Madison, Vanessa Kelson.
And you can watch the live debate right here on 15 News starting at 8 p.m. There will also be an NBC News special coverage and analysis. The debate will be 90 minutes long.